5. God leaves us room to be human. One of the most important things that any religion can teach us is what it means to be human. The Bible's vision of man is as fundamental to its overall outlook as its vision of God. 2 passages at the very beginning of the Bible teach us about being human, and tell us how we, as human beings, relate to God and to the world around us. The first is the statement in the opening chapter of the book of Genesis, that human beings are made in the image of God. At the climax of the creation process, God is represented as saying, "Let us make man in our image." Why the plural? Who is the us, the our of which God speaks? My suggestion for understanding that sentence is to see it as connected to the sentence immediately before it, in which God creates animals. In a description of creation which is astonishingly similar to the evolutionary process as scientists have come to unravel it, God first creates a world covered with water. He then causes the dry land to emerge, fills his world with plants, fish, birds, and reptiles, and finally with mammals. Having created the animals and beasts, he says to them, "Let us arrange for a new kind of creature to emerge, a human being, in our image, yours and mine. Let us fashion a creature who will be like you, an animal, in some ways, needing to eat, to sleep, to mate, and will be like me in other ways, rising above the animal level. You animals will contribute his physical dimension, and I will breathe a soul into him." And so, as the crown of creation, human beings are created, part animal, part divine. But what is the part of us that lifts us above the animal level, the part of ourselves that we share with God in a way that no other living creature does? For the answer to that question, we must turn to the second of the biblical passages, one of the most misunderstood stories in all of the Bible. The story of what happened in the Garden of Eden. After God created Adam and Eve, we read, He set them in the garden and told them that they could eat the fruit of all the trees in the garden, including the tree of life. Only the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was forbidden to them. God warned them that on the day they ate of that tree, they would die. Partly because of the serpent's urging, they ate the forbidden fruit. God confronted them with their disobedience and punished them in the following ways. They must leave the garden and no longer eat the fruit of the tree of life. They do not die that day, but are told that they will now bear children and die, instead of living forever. Eve will find the process of bearing and raising children painful. I will greatly multiply your pain and anguish, in pain will you bring forth children. Adam will have to work to grow food instead of merely finding it on trees. By the sweat of your brow will you earn your bread. There will be sexual tension between men and women. Your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. When you first read that story, or when it was first taught to you in Sunday school, you probably understood it as a simple story of Adam and Eve disobeying God's command and being punished for it. That was an appropriate level for a child to respond to it, and certainly a familiar message. Mommy told you not to play in the mud. You played in the mud anyway. Now you get no dessert. Perhaps, depending on the religious tradition in which you were raised, you were told that all human beings, Adam's and Eve's descendants, were doomed to die as sinners because of that original disobedience. Maybe even then you felt that it was unfair for God to punish them and their descendants so severely for one little mistake committed by a couple of inexperienced people, especially if they could not have been expected to know what good and evil were before they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I think there is more to the story than a simple case of disobeying God and being punished for it. My interpretation may be very different from the ones you have grown up with, but I think it makes sense and fits the biblical context. I think the story is about the differences between being human and being an animal, and the key to understanding it is the fact that the forbidden tree is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Human beings live in a world of good and bad, and that makes our lives painful and complicated. Animals don't, their lives are much simpler. Without the moral problems and moral decisions that we humans have to face. Categories of good and bad don't really exist for animals. They can be helpful or messy, obedient or disobedient, but they can't be good or bad. Terms like good doggy or bad doggy don't refer to the moral value of what the dog chooses to do, but only to its being convenient or inconvenient for us, like good weather and bad weather. Like our almost but not quite human ancestors, animals eat from the tree of life. They eat and drink, they run and they mate. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is off limits to them. To use a term which no one before our generation could have understood, animals are programmed. Built-in instincts tell them when to eat, when to sleep, and so on. They follow their instincts and have very few difficult decisions to make. Human beings, however, are unique in the world of living creatures. The image of God in us permits us to say no to instinct. On moral grounds, we can choose not to eat even though we are hungry. We can refrain from sex even when our instincts are aroused, not because we are afraid of being punished, but because we understand the terms good and bad in a way that no other animal can. The whole story of being human is the story of rising above our animal nature and learning to control our instincts. Let us look again at the punishments God visits on Adam and Eve. I put the word punishments in quotation marks because I am not sure they are really punishments. They are the painful consequences of being human, rather than being a mere animal. Every one of them represents a way in which life is more painful and problematic for human beings than it is for animals. Sex and reproduction are natural and non-problematic for all animals. Except man, females come into heat, males are attracted to them, and the species is maintained. Nothing could be simpler. Compare that to the sexual tensions existing among human beings, the teenage girl who waits for a boy to call her, feeling shunned and unattractive, the college student who cannot concentrate on his studies and is contemplating suicide because his girlfriend has broken up with him, the pregnant unmarried career woman who does not believe in abortion but is not sure what other choice she has, the severely depressed housewife whose husband has left her for another woman, the victims of rape, the patrons of pornographic movies, the furtive adulterers, the self-hating promiscuous sexual athletes. Sex is so simple and straightforward for animals, and so painful for the rest of us, unless we are willing to behave like animals, because we have entered the world of good and evil. But at the same time, precisely because we live in that world, a sexual relationship can mean infinitely more to us than it can to an animal, or to a person who sees sex only as an instinct to be satisfied. It can mean tenderness, sharing of affection, responsible commitment. Animals can mate and reproduce, but only human beings can know love, with all the pain that love sometimes involves. For animals, giving birth to young and supervising their growing up is a purely instinctive process. There is much less physical pain, and much less psychological pain, involved for them than there is for the human parent. When our family dog had a litter of puppies, she knew exactly what to do, without ever being told. Giving birth was uncomfortable, but not as painful as for a human mother. Our dog nursed her litter of puppies, and when they were old enough to take care of themselves, she began to ignore them. Now, when she meets one of her grown children, she recognizes another dog, but not necessarily one she is closely related to. Being a human parent can never be that easy. Giving birth, one of the most painful events a human body can experience, is in a sense the easiest part. Raising and teaching children, passing your values on to them, sharing their big and little hurts, being disappointed in them, knowing when to be tough and when to be forgiving, these are the painful parts of being a parent. And unlike the animals, we can't do it on instinct alone. We have to make hard choices. Similarly, people have to work hard for their food, either growing it themselves or performing some service to earn money to buy it. The world provides food for animals, for those who hunt and for those who graze. A lion may have to exert himself to stalk and kill an animal, and it may be very hard for him, but it cannot compare to the human experience of being fired from a job or having to decide whether to withhold important information when making a sale. Animals can depend on instinct to guide them in their search for food. Only humans in their work have to worry about choosing a career, keeping a job, getting along with the boss. Only humans have to weigh the pros and cons of doing something that may be illegal or unethical to keep a job or make a sale. Once again, a major area of Life which may be difficult for animals but is at least free of moral dilemmas, is for human beings a problematic and often painful area. And finally, all living creatures are fated to die, but only human beings know it. Animals will instinctively protect themselves against threats to their life and well-being, but only human beings live in the valley of the shadow of death, with the knowledge that they are mortal, even when no one is attacking them. This knowledge that we are going to die someday changes our lives in many ways. It moves us to try to cheat death by doing something that will outlive us: having children, writing books, having an impact on our friends and neighbors so that they will remember us fondly. Knowing that our time is limited gives value to the things we do. It matters that we choose to read a book or visit a sick friend instead of going to the movies, precisely because we don't have the time to do everything. This, then, is what happened to Adam and Eve. They became human. They had to leave the Garden of Eden, where animals eat from the tree of life, the tree of basic life forces and instincts. They entered the world of the knowledge of good and evil, a more painful, more complicated world, where they would have to make difficult moral choices. Eating and working, having children and raising children would no longer be simple matters, as they are for lower animals. These first human beings were now self-conscious. After eating the forbidden fruit, they felt the need to put on clothes. They knew that they would not live forever. But most of all, they would have to spend their lives making choices. This is what it means to be human, in the image of God. It means being free to make choices instead of doing whatever our instincts would tell us to do. It means knowing that some choices are good, and others are bad, and it is our job to know the difference. Behold, I have set before you the path of good and the path of evil, the way of life and the way of death. Choose life. Deuteronomy 30:19, that could not be said to any other living creature except man, for no other creature is free to choose. But if man is truly free to choose, if he can show himself as being virtuous by freely choosing the good when the bad is equally possible, then he has to be free to choose the bad also. If he were only free to do good, he would not really be choosing. If we are bound to do good, then we are not free to choose it. Imagine a parent saying to a child, "How would you like to spend this afternoon doing homework or playing with a friend? You choose." The child says, "I'd like to play with my friend." The parent responds, "I'm sorry, that's the wrong choice. I can't let you do that. I won't let you out of the house until your homework gets done. Choose again." This time the child says, "All right, I'll do my homework." The parent smiles and says, "I'm glad you made the right choice. We may have ended up with the preferred result, but it would be wrong to say that it was the child who showed maturity and responsibility by making that choice." Now imagine God saying to a person, "How do you plan to get the money to pay your bills? Are you going to get a job, which means getting up early in the morning and doing hard work, or are you going to grab an old lady's pocketbook and run off with it?" The man answers, "I was thinking of going out and stealing a pocketbook." God says, "No, that's wrong. I won't let you do that. Choose again." This time the man reluctantly agrees to get a job. A robbery has been prevented, but has the man been permitted to operate as a morally free human being? Has God permitted him to choose between the path of good and the path of evil? Or has God reduced him to the level of an animal by taking away his freedom to choose, and compelling him to take the better path? In order to let us be free, in order to let us be human, God has to leave us free to choose to do right or to do wrong. If we are not free to choose evil, then we are not free to choose good either. Like the animals, we can only be convenient or inconvenient, obedient or disobedient. We can no longer be moral, which means we can no longer be human. None of us can read God's mind, to know why, at a certain point in the evolutionary process, he had a new kind of creature emerge, a morally free animal who could choose to be good or bad. But he did, and the world has seen a lot of nobility and a lot of cruelty ever since. Our moral freedom means that, if we choose to be selfish or dishonest, we can be selfish and dishonest, and God will not stop us. If we want to take Something that does not belong to us, God will not reach down and pull our hand away from the cookie jar. If we want to hurt someone, God will not intervene to keep us from doing it. All He will do is tell us that certain things are wrong, warn us that we will be sorry for having done them, and hope that, if we don't take His word for it, we will at least learn from experience. God is not like a human parent who watches as his child takes its first shaky steps or struggles with an algebra assignment, and who says to himself, "If I intervene, I will spare my child a lot of pain," but how will he ever learn to do it for himself? A human parent in that situation has the possibility, and the responsibility, to intervene if the child is on the verge of doing himself serious harm. But God has set Himself the limit that He will not intervene to take away our freedom, including our freedom to hurt ourselves and others around us. He has already let man evolve morally free. And there is no turning back the evolutionary clock. Why, then, do bad things happen to good people? One reason is that our being human leaves us free to hurt each other, and God can't stop us without taking away the freedom that makes us human. Human beings can cheat each other, rob each other, hurt each other, and God can only look down in pity and compassion at how little we have learned over the ages about how human beings should behave. This line of reasoning helps me understand that monstrous eruption of evil we speak of as the Holocaust, the death of millions of innocent people at the hands of Adolf Hitler. When people ask, where was God in Auschwitz? How could He have permitted the Nazis to kill so many innocent men, women, and children? My response is that it was not God who caused it. It was caused by human beings choosing to be cruel to their fellow men. In the words of a German Christian theologian, Dorothy Soel, speaking of attempts to justify the Holocaust as God's will, who wants such a God? Who gains anything from worshipping Him? Was God on the side of the victims or on the side of the executioner? To try to explain the Holocaust, or any suffering, as God's will is to side with the executioner rather than with his victim, and to claim that God does the same. I cannot make sense of the Holocaust by taking it to be God's will. Even if I could accept the death of an innocent individual now and then without having to rethink all of my beliefs, the Holocaust represents too many deaths, too much evidence against the view that God is in charge and He has His reasons. I have to believe that the Holocaust was at least as much of an offense to God's moral code as it is to mine, or how can I respect God as a source of moral guidance? Why did 6 million Jews, and several million other innocent victims, die in Hitler's death camps? Who was responsible? We fall back on the idea of human freedom to choose. Man, we discovered, is that unique creature whose behavior is not programmed. He is free to choose to be good, which means he must be free to choose to be evil. Some good people are good on a relatively modest scale. They are charitable, they visit the sick. They help a neighbor change a flat tire. Others are good on a grander scale. They work diligently to discover a cure for a disease, or they fight for the extension of the rights of the poor and the powerless. Some bad people choose evil, but have the capacity to be evil only on a small scale. They lie, cheat, take things that do not belong to them. And some have the ability to do harm to millions, even as their good counterparts have the ability to be helpful to millions. Hitler must have been one of those rare geniuses of evil who, having chosen to be destructive, had the ability to be more destructive than virtually anyone else in history. This raises a question which is not really part of our discussion. Can we say that someone like Hitler chose to be destructive? Or would we have to go back and look at his parents, his home environment, his teachers, his early life experiences and historical circumstances that made him become the person he was? There is probably no clear answer to that question. Social scientists have been debating it for years, and will continue to do so. I can only say that the cornerstone of my religious outlook is the belief that human beings are free to choose the direction their life will take. Granted, some children are born with physical or mental capacities which limit their freedom of choice. Not everyone can choose to be an opera singer, a surgeon, or a professional athlete. Granted, further, that some parents mishandle their children badly, that accidental Events, wars, illnesses traumatize children so badly that they may not be able to do something they would otherwise be qualified for, and that some people are so addicted to habits that it is hard to speak of them as being free. But I will insist that every adult, no matter how unfortunate a childhood he had or how habit-ridden he may be, is free to make choices about his life. If we are not free, if we are bound by circumstances and experiences, then we are no different from the animal who is bound by instinct. To say of Hitler, to say of any criminal, that he did not choose to be bad but was a victim of his upbringing, is to make all morality, all discussion of right and wrong, impossible. It leaves unanswered the question of why people in similar circumstances did not all become Hitlers. But worse, to say it is not his fault, he was not free to choose, is to rob a person of his humanity, and reduce him to the level of an animal who is similarly not free to choose between right and wrong. The Holocaust happened because Hitler was a demented evil genius who chose to do harm on a massive scale. But he did not cause it alone. Hitler was only one man, and even his ability to do evil was limited. The Holocaust happened because thousands of others could be persuaded to join him in his madness, and millions of others permitted themselves to be frightened or shamed into cooperating. It happened because angry, frustrated people were willing to vent their anger and frustration on innocent victims as soon as someone encouraged them to do so. It happened because Hitler was able to persuade lawyers to forget their commitment to justice and doctors to violate their oaths. And it happened because democratic governments were unwilling to summon their people to stand up to Hitler as long as their own interests were not yet at stake. Where was God while all this was going on? Why did he not intervene to stop it? Why didn't he strike Hitler dead in 1939 and spare millions of lives and untold suffering? Or why didn't he send an earthquake to demolish the gas chambers? Where was God? I have to believe, with Dorothy Soel, that he was with the victims, and not with the murderers, but that he does not control man's choosing between good and evil. I have to believe that the tears and prayers of the victims aroused God's compassion, but having given man freedom to choose, including the freedom to choose to hurt his neighbor, there was nothing God could do to prevent it. Christianity introduced the world to the idea of a God who suffers, alongside the image of a God who creates and commands. Post-biblical Judaism also occasionally spoke of a God who suffers, a God who is made homeless and goes into exile along with his exiled people, a God who weeps when he sees what some of his children are doing to others of his children. I don't know what it means for God to suffer. I don't believe that God is a person like me, with real eyes and real tear ducts to cry, and real nerve endings to feel pain. But I would like to think that the anguish I feel when I read of the sufferings of innocent people reflects God's anguish and God's compassion, even if his way of feeling pain is different from ours. I would like to think that he is the source of my being able to feel sympathy and outrage, and that he and I are on the same side when we stand with the victim against those who would hurt him. The last word, appropriately, comes from a survivor of Auschwitz. It never occurred to me to question God's doings or lack of doings while I was an inmate of Auschwitz, although of course I understand others did. I was no less or no more religious because of what the Nazis did to us, and I believe my faith in God was not undermined in the least. It never occurred to me to associate the calamity we were experiencing with God, to blame him, or to believe in him less or cease believing in him at all because he didn't come to our aid. God doesn't owe us that, or anything. We owe our lives to him. If someone believes God is responsible for the death of 6 million because he didn't somehow do something to save them, he's got his thinking reversed. We owe God our lives for the few or many years we live. And we have the duty to worship him and do as he commands us. That's what we're here on earth for, to be in God's service, to do God's bidding. Brenner 6. God helps those who stop hurting themselves. One of the worst things that happens to a person who has been hurt by life is that he tends to compound the damage by hurting himself a second time. Not only is he the victim of rejection, bereavement, injury, or bad luck, he often feels the need to see himself as a bad person who had this coming to him, and because of that drives away people who try to come close to him and help him. Too often, in our pain and confusion, we instinctively do the wrong thing. We don't feel we deserve to be helped, so we let guilt, anger, jealousy, and self-imposed loneliness make a bad situation even worse. I once read of an Iranian folk proverb, if you see a blind man, kick him. Why should you be kinder than God? In other words, if you see someone who is suffering, you must believe that he deserves his fate and that God wants him to suffer. Therefore, put yourself on God's side by shunning him or humiliating him further. If you try to help him, you will be going against God's justice. Most of us probably respond to this point of view with the feeling, that's terrible. We usually think that we know better than to do that. But too often, we inadvertently find ourselves saying to people who have been hurt that they, in some way, deserved it. And when we do that, we feed into their latent sense of guilt, the suspicion that maybe this happened to them because they did somehow have it coming. Do you remember Job's comforters from the biblical story? When the 3 friends came to visit Job, they genuinely wanted to comfort him for his losses and his illness. But they did almost everything wrong, and ended up by making him feel worse. Can we learn from their mistakes what a person needs when he has been hurt by life, and how we as friends and neighbors can be helpful to him? Their first mistake was to think that when Job said, "Why is God doing this to me?" he was asking a question, and that they would be helping him by answering his question, by explaining why God was doing it. In reality, Job's words were not a theological question at all, but a cry of pain. There should have been an exclamation point after those words, not a question mark. What Job needed from his friends, what he was really asking for when he said, "Why is God doing this to me?" was not theology, but sympathy. He did not really want them to explain God to him, and he certainly did not want them to show him where his theology was faulty. He wanted them to tell him that he was in fact a good person, and that the things that were happening to him were terribly tragic and unfair. But the friends got so bogged down talking about God that they almost forgot about Job, except to tell him that he must have done something pretty awful to deserve this fate at the hands of a righteous God. Because the friends had never been in Job's position, they could not realize how unhelpful, how offensive it was for them to be judging Job, to be telling him he should not cry and complain so much. Even if they themselves had experienced similar losses, they would still have no right to sit in judgment of Job's grief. It is hard to know what to say to a person who has been struck by tragedy, but it is easier to know what not to say. Anything critical of the mourner, don't take it so hard, try to hold back your tears, you're upsetting people, is wrong. Anything which tries to minimize the mourner's pain, it's probably for the best. It could be a lot worse, she's better off now, is likely to be misguided and unappreciated. Anything which asks the mourner to disguise or reject his feelings, we have no right to question God. God must love you to have selected you for this burden, is wrong as well. Under the impact of his multiple tragedies, Job was trying desperately to hold on to his self-respect, his sense of himself as a good person. The last thing in the world he needed was to be told that what he was doing was wrong. Whether the criticisms were about the way he was grieving or about what he had done to deserve such a fate, their effect was that of rubbing salt into an open wound. Job needed sympathy more than he needed advice, even good and correct advice. There would be a time and place for that later. He needed compassion, the sense that others felt his pain with him, more than he needed learned theological explanations about God's ways. He needed physical comforting, people sharing their strength with him, holding him, rather than scolding him. He needed friends who would permit him to be angry, to cry and to scream, much more than he needed friends who would urge him to be an example of patience and piety to others. He needed people to say, "Yes, what happened to you is terrible and makes no sense," not people who would say, "Cheer up, Job, it's not all that bad." And that was where his friends let him down. The phrase, Job's comforters, has come into the language to describe people who mean to help, but who are more concerned with their own needs and feelings than they are with those of the other person, and so end up only making things worse. Job's friends did do at least 2 things right, though. First of all, they came. I am sure that the prospect of seeing their friend in his misery was painful for them to contemplate, and they must have been tempted to stay away and leave him alone. It is not pleasant to see a friend suffering, and most of us would rather avoid the experience. We either stay away entirely, so that the suffering person experiences isolation and a sense of rejection on top of his tragedy, or we come and try to avoid the reason for our being there. Hospital visits and condolence calls become discussions of the weather, the stock market, or the pennant race, taking on an air of unreality, as the most important subject on the mind of everyone present is left conspicuously unmentioned. Job's friends at least mustered the courage to face him and to confront his sorrow. And secondly, they listened. According to the biblical account, they sat with Job for several days, not saying anything, while Job poured out his grief and anger. That, I suspect, was the most helpful part of their visit. Nothing they did after that did Job as much good. When Job finished his outburst, they should have said, "Yes, it's really awful. We don't know how you put up with it," instead of feeling compelled to defend God and conventional wisdom. Their silent presence must have been a lot more helpful to their friend than their lengthy theological explanations were. We can all learn a lesson from that. I had an experience some years ago which taught me something about the ways in which people make a bad situation worse by blaming themselves. One January, I had to officiate at 2 funerals on successive days for 2 elderly women in my community. Both had died full of years, as the Bible would say. Both succumbed to the normal wearing out of the body after a long and full life. Their homes happened to be near each other, so I paid condolence calls on the 2 families on the same afternoon. At the first home, the son of the deceased woman said to me, "If only I had sent my mother to Florida and gotten her out of this cold and snow, she would be alive today. It's my fault that she died." At the second home, the son of the other deceased woman said, "If only I hadn't insisted on my mother's going to Florida, she would be alive today. That long airplane ride, the abrupt change of climate, was more than she could take. It's my fault that she's dead." When things don't turn out as we would like them to, it is very tempting to assume that had we done things differently, the story would have had a happier ending. Clergymen know that any time there is a death, the survivors will feel guilty because the course of action they took turned out badly. They believe that the opposite course, keeping mother at home, deferring the operation, would have turned out better. After all, how could it have turned out any worse? Survivors feel guilty for still being alive while a loved one is dead. They feel guilty when they think of all the kind words they never got around to saying to the deceased, and the good things they never found time to do for her. Indeed, many of the mourning rituals in all religions are designed to help the bereaved get rid of these irrational feelings of guilt for a tragedy they did not in fact cause. But the sense of guilt, the sense of "it's my fault," seems to be universal. There seem to be 2 elements involved in our readiness to feel guilt. The first is our strenuous need to believe that the world makes sense, that there is a cause for every effect and a reason for everything that happens. That leads us to find patterns and connections both where they really exist. Smoking leads to lung cancer, people who wash their hands have fewer contagious diseases, and where they exist only in our minds, the Red Sox win every time I wear my lucky sweater. That boy I like talks to me on odd-numbered days, but not on even-numbered ones, except where there has been a holiday to throw the pattern off. How many public and personal superstitions are based on something good or bad having happened right after we did something, and are assuming that the same thing will follow the same pattern every time? The second element is the notion that we are the cause of what happens, especially the bad things that happen. It seems to be a short step from believing that every event has a cause to believing that every disaster is our fault. The roots of this feeling may lie in our childhood. Psychologists speak of the infantile myth of omnipotence. A baby comes to think that the world exists to meet his needs, and that he makes everything happen in it. He wakes up in the morning and summons the rest of the world to its tasks. He cries, and someone comes to attend to him. When he is hungry, people feed him, and when he is wet, people change him. Very often, we do not completely outgrow that infantile notion that our wishes cause things to happen. A part of our mind continues to believe that people get sick because we hate them. Our parents, in fact, often feed this notion, not realizing how vulnerable our childhood egos are. They snap at us when they are tired or frustrated for reasons that have nothing to do with us. They bawl us out for being in the way, for leaving toys around or having the television set on too loud, and we in our childhood innocence assume that they are justified and we are the problem. Their anger may pass in a moment, but we continue to bear the scars of feeling at fault, thinking that whenever something goes wrong, we are to blame for it. Years later, should something bad happen to us or around us, feelings from our childhood re-emerge and we instinctively assume that we have messed things up again. Even Job would rather have had God document his guilt than admit that it was all a mistake. If he could be shown that he deserved his fate, then at least the world would make sense. It would be no pleasure to suffer for one's misdeeds, but it might be easier to take than finding out that we live in a random world where things happen for no reason. Sometimes, of course, a feeling of guilt is appropriate and necessary. Sometimes we have caused the sorrow in our lives and ought to take responsibility. The man who sat in my office one day, telling me how he left his wife and young children to marry his secretary, and asking me how I could help him get over his guilt for what he had done to his children, was making an improper request of me. He should have felt guilty, and he should have been thinking in terms of making amends to his first family, rather than looking for a way to shake his sense of guilt. A sense of our inadequacies and failings, a recognition that we could be better people than we usually are, is one of the forces for moral growth and improvement in our society. An appropriate sense of guilt makes people try to be better. But an excessive sense of guilt, a tendency to blame ourselves for things which are clearly not our fault, robs us of our self-esteem and perhaps of our capacity to grow and to act. One of the hardest things Bob ever did was to put his 78-year-old mother in a nursing home. It was a borderline case, because his mother was basically alert and healthy and did not require medical care, but could no longer feed or take care of herself. 6 months earlier, Bob and his wife had taken her into their home after her apartment caught fire when she forgot to turn off the stove. She was lonely, depressed, and confused. Bob's wife had to come home from her job at noon to give her mother-in-law lunch and sit her in front of the television set until the children came home from school. Bob's teenage daughter cut down on her evening social life to babysit for grandma when Bob and his wife went out. The children were discouraged from bringing friends into the house. It's a small house and gets awfully noisy. After a few weeks, it was clear that the arrangement was not working out. The members of the family were becoming edgy and irritable with one another. Each one was keeping score of how much he or she had given up. Bob loved his mother, the children loved grandma, but they realized that she needed more than they were in a position to give. They were not prepared to make the sacrifices of time and lifestyle which caring for a sick old woman required. They talked it over one night, made some inquiries, and reluctantly, but with a palpable sense of relief, placed her in a nearby nursing home. Bob knew that he was doing the right thing, but he still felt guilty about it. His mother hadn't wanted to go. She offered to be less demanding at home, to be less in the way. She cried when she saw the older, more crippled residents of the home, wondering perhaps how soon she would come to look like them. That weekend, Bob, who did not usually think of himself as a religious person, decided to go to services before he drove out to visit his mother. He was feeling strange about the visit, afraid of what he would find or what his mother would tell him, and he hoped that going to a religious service would give him the tranquility and peace of mind he needed. As luck would have it, the sermon that morning was on the 5th commandment, honor your father and mother. The clergyman spoke of the sacrifices parents make in raising children, and of the reluctance of children to appreciate those sacrifices. He criticized the self-centeredness of today's younger generation, saying, "Why is it that one mother can care for 6 children, but 6 children can't care for one mother?" All around Bob were older men and women, nodding their heads approvingly. Bob left the service feeling hurt and angry. He felt that he had just been told, in the name of God, that he was a selfish and uncaring person. At lunch, he was irritable with his wife and children. At the nursing home, he was impatient with his mother and unable to respond to her. He was ashamed of what he had done to her, and angry at her for being the cause of his embarrassment and condemnation. The visit was an emotional disaster, leaving all parties wondering if the placement would ever work out. Bob was haunted by the idea that his mother didn't have long to live, and that, when she died, he would never be able to forgive himself for having made her last years miserable because of his selfishness. Bob's situation would have been difficult under any circumstances. The guilt feelings, the ambivalence were there from the start. The helplessness of aging parents, their appeals to their children, tap feelings of inadequacy, buried resentment, and guilt in many perfectly decent people. It is a hard situation to handle under the best of conditions. The parents are often scared, vulnerable, and sometimes emotionally immature as well. They may not be above using illness, loneliness, or guilt to manipulate their children into giving them the attention they desperately need. The proverbial Jewish mother who keeps reminding her children of her sacrifices in the name of their happiness, creating a debt that no one could work off in a lifetime, has become a stock figure of literature and humor. How many Jewish mothers does it take to change a light bulb? None. Don't worry about me. Go have a good time. I'll be alright sitting here in the dark. But Bob's situation was made worse by his hearing the voice of religion as a judgmental one. There should be sermons about the honor due parents, but they should be careful not to play upon people's predisposition to feel guilty. Had Bob been more clear-eyed that morning, he might have told the preacher that perhaps 6 children can't take care of one mother because those 6 children all have spouses and children of their own. He could have explained that he loved his mother, but had a primary loyalty to the well-being of his own wife and children, even as, when he was young, his mother had loved her parents but had been more concerned with him than she was with them. Had Bob been more confident of the rightness of what he had done, he might have spoken back to those accusations. But because he walked into the service feeling just a little guilty, the minister's words seemed to confirm his own troubling thoughts that he was, in fact, a bad and selfish person. Our egos are so vulnerable, it is so easy to make us feel that we are bad people, that it is unworthy of religion to manipulate us in that way. Indeed, the goal of religion should be to help us feel good about ourselves when we have made honest and reasonable, but sometimes painful choices about our lives. Even more than adults, children tend to see themselves as the center of their world, and to believe that their acts make things happen. They need a lot of reassurance that when a parent dies, they did not cause it. Daddy didn't die because you were angry at him. He died because he had an accident, or a serious sickness, and all the doctors couldn't make him get better. We know that you loved your daddy, even if sometimes you got angry at him. We all get angry at people we love sometimes, but that doesn't mean that we don't love them or that we really want something bad to happen to them. Children need to be assured that the parent who died did not reject them or choose to leave them, an idea they might easily get from such explanations as, "Daddy's gone away and he won't be coming back." Even the author of the 27th Psalm in the Bible, a mature adult and a gifted poet, speaks of the death of his parents in those terms: "For my father and mother have left me." He is so emotionally involved in their deaths that he cannot see things from their point of view, that they were sick and died, but only from his own, that they left him. It would be good to reassure a child that her father wanted to live, that he wanted to come home from the hospital and do things with her the way he used to, but the illness or accident was so bad that he couldn't. To try to make a child feel better by telling him how beautiful it is in heaven and how happy his father is to be with God is another way of depriving him of the chance to grieve. When we do that, we ask a child to deny and mistrust his own feelings, to be happy when he really wants to be sad even as all of us around him are sad. The child's right to feel upset and angry, and the appropriateness of her being angry at the situation, not at the deceased parent or at God, should be recognized at a time like this. The death of another child, whether brother, friend, or stranger whose death is publicized in the media, also introduces into the child's world a sense of vulnerability. For the first time, he realizes that something scary and painful can happen to someone his age. I had been in my present congregation less than a year when I was called on to break the news to a father and mother that their 5-year-old son had been run over and killed by the bus that was bringing him home from day camp. In addition to trying to help the parents deal with their own overwhelming grief, and in addition to dealing with my own feelings, I liked the boy, I liked the family, and I had recently learned that my own son would die young. I had to explain to my own children and to other youngsters in the community how such a thing could happen to a young child. As I was leaving to be with the parents the evening after the accident, my son Aaron, who was then 4, asked me where I was going. I was reluctant to tell him that a boy nearly his own age had been killed, and then run out of the house before we could talk about it, so I said that a boy had been hurt in an accident and I was going to see how he was doing. At 7 the next morning, Aaron's first words to me were, "Is the little boy all right?" My answer to the dead child's neighborhood and nursery school playmates came in 2 parts. First, I told them that what had happened to Jonathan was very unusual. That was why everybody was talking about it. That was why it was on the radio and the front page of the local newspaper. This sort of thing so rarely happens that it is big news when it does, because it is so unusual. Almost all the time, children get off buses and cross streets safely. Almost all the time, children who fall down and hurt themselves get better after a little while. Almost all the time, when children get sick, doctors are able to make them feel better. But sometimes, on very rare occasions, a child gets hurt or gets sick and nobody can make him better. And he dies. When that happens, everybody is very surprised and very sad. Secondly, I told the children, I don't want you to think that what happened to Jonathan was a punishment for his being bad. If you are remembering that Jonathan did something a little naughty a few days ago, and yesterday he was run over and died, it doesn't mean that if you sometimes do that same naughty thing, something bad is going to happen to you. Jonathan didn't get run over because he was a bad boy and deserved to get punished. He deserved to go on living, playing, and having fun, but this terrible, senseless accident happened. Children who are upset by the sight of a crippled or handicapped person, or shy away from a blind person or a man with an artificial limb because they are frightened by the thought that something similar may happen to them, should be given a similar explanation. I don't know what happened to that man. Maybe he was in an accident. Maybe he had a serious disease. Maybe he was in the army, fighting to protect this country, and was wounded. It certainly doesn't mean that he was a bad person whom God is punishing. Think of all the fairy tales in which hunchbacks, misshapen people with missing limbs, like Peter Pan's arch-foe, Captain Hook, are portrayed as subhuman villains who threaten children. We can try to urge young children to be aware of the 95% of a person that is normal, rather than the one organ that is flawed, in the people they see, and in themselves. Sometimes, talking openly with a crippled or handicapped person about his artificial limb or missing vision can ease the barrier of strangeness and dispel the fear the child feels. This won't always be possible, though. Sometimes crippled or handicapped people find it hard to be stared at or to talk about their infirmities. For their own emotional stability, they may find it necessary to be taken as just like anyone else. Children are particularly susceptible to feelings of guilt. But even as adults, many of us never totally outgrow that tendency. A wrong word, even by someone trying to be helpful, will serve to reinforce the feeling that it was, in fact, our fault. Beverly was crushed when her husband announced that he was leaving her. They had been married 5 years. They had no children. He had convinced her that they couldn't afford to have her leave her job quite yet. They had had arguments, but Beverly thought their marriage was no better and no worse than those of their friends. Then, one Saturday morning, he told her he had decided to leave. He said that he found her boring, that he was finding other women he had met more interesting, and that he did not think it was fair to either of them to be stuck with each other under the circumstances. An hour later, he had packed his clothes and was on his way to a friend's apartment. Stunned, Beverly drove to her parents' home and broke the news to them. They cried with her, comforted her, alternated between bitterness at her husband and practical advice about lawyers, house keys, and bank accounts. After dinner that evening, Beverly's mother, a caring and concerned woman, took her aside and tried to talk to her about it. Trying to be helpful, she asked about their sex life, their finances, their patterns of interaction, looking for any clue to what might have caused the problem. Suddenly, Beverly threw down her coffee cup and burst out, "Will you please stop this? I'm tired of hearing, maybe if you had done this and maybe if you hadn't done that. You make it sound like it was all my fault. You're telling me that if I had tried harder to be a good wife, he wouldn't have left me. Well, that's not fair. I was a good wife. I don't deserve to have this happen. It's not my fault." And she was right, even as her mother was right to try to talk to her and comfort her. It is gratuitous, even cruel, to tell the person who has been hurt, whether by divorce or death or other disaster, maybe if you had acted differently, things would not have turned out so badly. When we say that, all we are really telling them is, this is your fault for having chosen as you did. Sometimes marriages fail because people are immature, or because expectations are unrealistic on both sides. Sometimes people die because they have incurable diseases, not because their families turned to the wrong doctor or waited too long to go to the hospital. Sometimes businesses fail because economic conditions or powerful competition doom them, not because one person in charge made a wrong decision in a crucial moment. If we want to be able to pick up the pieces of our lives and go on living, we have to get over the irrational feeling that every misfortune is our fault, the direct result of our mistakes or misbehavior. We are really not that powerful. Not everything that happens in the world is our doing. Some years ago, I officiated at the funeral of a 38-year-old woman who had died of leukemia, leaving a husband and one child, a boy of 15. As I entered the family's home after the burial, I heard an aunt say to the boy, "Don't feel bad, Barry. God took your mother because he needed her now more than you did." I give the aunt the benefit of the doubt. Surely she was trying to make Barry feel better. She was trying somehow to make sense of a horrible and tragic event. But it seems to me that she did at least 3 things seriously wrong in those 2 sentences. First of all, she told Barry not to feel bad. Yet why shouldn't he feel bad? On the day of his mother's funeral? Why shouldn't he be entitled to honest feelings of pain, anger, loss? Why should he have to censor his honest, legitimate feelings in order to make the day easier for other people? Second, she explained his mother's death in terms of God taking her away. I don't believe that. It doesn't fit my understanding of God, and it can serve only to make Barry resentful of God and less open to the comforting ministrations of religion. But most seriously of all, she suggested that God had taken Barry's mother because he needed her now more than you did. I think I understand what she was trying to say. She wanted to say that her sister-in-law's death was not meaningless, that it served some purpose in God's scheme of things. But I suspect that was not the message that Barry got. What Barry heard was, "It's your fault that your mother died. You didn't need her enough. If you had needed her more, she would still be alive." Can you remember what it was like to be 15 years old, taking your first faltering steps toward independence, loving and needing your parents, and yet impatient with the fact that you needed them, eager for the day when you could outgrow your need for them and be on your own? If Barry was a typical 15-year-old, he ate the food his parents bought and cooked for him, wore the clothes they purchased for him, lived in a room in their house, had to ask them to drive him where he needed to go, and dreamed of the day when he wouldn't need them in those ways anymore. Then suddenly his mother died, and his aunt explained her death by saying, "You didn't need her enough, that's why she died." That was not what he needed to hear that day. I had to spend many hours with Barry, overcoming his initial anger at me as the representative of the cruel God who had snatched his mother from him, overcoming his reluctance to discuss a painful subject which he was Afraid would point up his guilt and shame. I had to persuade him that his mother's death was not his fault. She didn't die because he resented her, neglected her, aggravated her, or sometimes wished she would get out of his life. She died because she had leukemia. I told him I didn't know why his mother got leukemia. I didn't know why anybody gets it. But I believed as strongly as I believe anything that God had not willed it, not as a punishment for him, not as a punishment for her. I said to Barry, as I feel religious people should say to those who have been hurt by life, this was not your fault. You are a good, decent person who deserves better. I can understand that you feel hurt, confused, angry at what happened, but there is no reason why you should feel guilty. As a man of faith, I have come here in God's name, not to judge you, but to help you. Will you let me help you? Whenever bad things happen to good people, there is likely to be the feeling that we might have prevented the misfortune if we had acted differently. And there will almost certainly be feelings of anger. It seems to be instinctive to become angry when we are hurt. I stubbed my toe against a chair, and I am angry at the chair for being there, and angry at myself for not watching where I was going. One of the important questions when we are hurt and angry is, what do we do with our anger? Linda, a school guidance counselor, came home one afternoon and found that her apartment had been robbed. Her television set and tape deck were gone. Jewelry that had been given to her by her grandmother was missing. Clothes were strewn all around the apartment. Her lingerie drawer was emptied onto the floor. Linda was even more hurt and upset by this invasion of her privacy than she was by the monetary loss. Feeling almost physically violated, she fell into a chair and cried at the unfairness of it all. A complicated mixture of emotions washed over her. She felt hurt, ashamed, without knowing why, angry at herself for not making the apartment more secure, angry at her job for keeping her away from home and leaving the apartment accessible to burglars, and for making her come home so emotionally drained that she couldn't handle this additional insult. She felt angry at the superintendent of the building and at the policeman on the corner for not protecting her property better, angry at the city for being so full of criminals and junkies, angry at the world in general for being so unfair. She had been hurt, and she knew that she was deeply upset, but she was confused about where to direct her anger. Sometimes we turn our anger upon the person responsible for hurting us. The supervisor who fired us, the wife who walked out on us, the driver who caused the accident. Sometimes, because our anger is more than we can contain, we find someone to blame, guilty or not, convincing ourselves that they could have and should have prevented the tragedy. I have had people tell me about the death 10 years ago of a wife or child, and in the course of telling their story, they will become just as angry as they were 10 years ago at the doctor who couldn't be reached or who missed a diagnosis. Some of the worst instances of this are the trading of accusations by husband and wife after a child has died. Why weren't you watching him more carefully? Why weren't you home so that I wouldn't have had my hands full with so many things all over the house? Maybe if you had fed him better. If he hadn't gotten chilled on that stupid fishing trip. My side of the family has always been healthy, it's your relatives who are disease prone. A man and a woman who care about each other have been badly hurt. Because they were hurt, they are angry, and they direct their anger at the closest available target. Similar, but not quite as tragic, is the man who loses his job and takes his anger out on his wife. She distracted him from concentrating on his job with problems at home. She demoralized him, didn't entertain the boss or the important customer properly. Sometimes, if we can't find another person to dump our anger on, we turn it on ourselves. The textbook definition of depression is anger turned inward instead of being discharged outward. I suspect we have all known people who became depressed after a death, a divorce, a rejection, or loss of a job. They stayed home, slept till noon, neglected their personal appearance, and spurned all efforts at friendship. This is depression, our anger at being hurt turned inward onto ourselves. If we blame ourselves, we want to hurt ourselves, to punish ourselves for what we messed up. And sometimes we are angry at God because we were brought up to believe that everything that happens is his will, we hold him responsible for what happened, or at the very least for not having prevented it from happening. Religious people stop being religious, perhaps because they find the prayers and ceremonies no longer express their feelings. What do I have to be thankful for? Perhaps as a way of getting even with God. Sometimes tragedy makes non-religious people religious in an angry, defiant way. I have to believe in God, one man told me, so that I have someone to blame, someone to curse and shout at, when I think of what I've gone through. In his novel The Promise, Chaim Potok tells the story of a boy who becomes mentally ill because he can't handle his anger at his father. Michael Gordon loves and admires his father so much that he can't face the fact that he often resents him and feels angry toward him. The psychiatrist, Danny Saunders, is able to help Michael because he has had to work through his own ambivalent feelings of love, hate, admiration, anger toward his own powerful, admirable, dominating father, and has done so successfully. One of the fascinating minor characters in The Promise is Rabbi Kalman, a teacher in the rabbinical seminary attended by Danny's best friend, who is the book's narrator. Rabbi Kalman is a survivor of the Holocaust. His wife and children died in the concentration camps. He is a rigidly Orthodox Jew who considers it a sin even to raise questions about God and why he does things the way he does. One must believe wholeheartedly, without doubts. While Potok never makes the point explicitly, I understood the character of Rabbi Kalman to be intended to provide a parallel to Danny Saunders and Michael Gordon. Just as Michael became sick because he couldn't handle his anger at his father, Rabbi Kalman has become a tyrannical, unsympathetic person because he can't face up to his anger at his father in heaven. Rabbi Kalman permits no doubting, no questioning of God. Because somewhere in the recesses of his mind he knows how furiously angry he is at God for the death of his family, and he knows that any questions will end in an angry outburst against God, maybe even the rejection of God and religion entirely. And he can't risk that happening. Is Rabbi Kalman afraid that his anger, should he ever unleash it, is so powerful it would destroy God? Or is he afraid that, should he ever reveal how angry he is, God will punish him even further? In the novel, Michael is made whole by being taught not to be afraid of his anger. His anger is normal, understandable, and a lot less destructive than he has believed. He is told, to his immense relief, that it is all right to be angry at people you love. But no one tells Rabbi Kalman that it is all right to be angry at God. Actually, being angry at God won't hurt God, and neither will it provoke him to take measures against us. If it makes us feel better to vent our anger at him over a painful situation, we are free to do it. The only thing wrong with doing it is that what happened to us was not really God's fault. What do we do with our anger when we have been hurt? The goal, if we can achieve it, would be to be angry at the situation, rather than at ourselves, or at those who might have prevented it or are close to us trying to help us, or at God who let it happen. Getting angry at ourselves makes us depressed. Being angry at other people scares them away and makes it harder for them to help us. Being angry at God erects a barrier between us and all the sustaining, comforting resources of religion that are there to help us at such times. But being angry at the situation, recognizing it as something rotten, unfair, and totally undeserved, shouting about it, denouncing it, crying over it, permits us to discharge the anger which is a part of being hurt, without making it harder for us to be helped. Jealousy is almost as inevitable a part of being hurt by life as our guilt and anger. How can the injured person not feel jealous of people who may not deserve better, but have received better? How can the widow not be jealous of even her closest friends who still have a husband to go home to? How should the woman whose doctor has told her she will never be able to bear children react when her sister-in-law confides to her that something may have gone wrong and she may be pregnant a fourth time? It serves no purpose to try to moralize against jealousy and talk people out of it. Jealousy is too strong a feeling. It touches us too deeply, hurting us in places we care about. Some psychologists trace the origins of jealousy to sibling rivalry. As children, we compete with our brothers and sisters for our parents' limited love and attention. It is so important to us, not only to be treated well, but to be treated better than the others. The white meat of the chicken, the largest dessert are not only servings of food but symbolic statements about which child our parents love most. It is that reassurance of winning the love contest, not the food, that we yearn for and compete for. Did you know that the first mention of sin in the Bible is not in connection with Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit, but relates to Cain killing his brother Abel in a fit of jealousy, because God preferred Abel's offering to his own. When we grow up, we may never entirely outgrow those childhood habits of competition, of needing to be reassured that we are more loved, even as we may never totally outgrow the habit of thinking of God as a heavenly parent. For us to suffer an accident or bereavement is bad enough, but for us to suffer it while those around us don't is even worse, because that awakens all the old childhood competitiveness in us, and seems to proclaim to all that God loves them more than He loves us. We can understand the logic of the statement that we would not be any healthier if our friends and neighbors were seriously ill, nor would we take any pleasure in their being sick. We can know full well that we would be just as lonely in our bereavement if our friends' husbands died, and we don't really want that to happen. It will happen one day, and then we will have to contend with our guilt feelings for having wished it. We can know all that, and still feel resentful toward them for having their health, their families, their jobs when we have lost ours. We can even understand that as we resent the good fortune of the people around us, we make it harder for them to help us, because they sense the resentment and the estrangement. We hurt ourselves more than anyone else by feeling jealous, and we know it. But we still feel it. There is an old Chinese tale about the woman whose only son died. In her grief, she went to the holy man and said, "What prayers, what magical incantations do you have to bring my son back to life?" Instead of sending her away or reasoning with her, he said to her, "Fetch me a mustard seed from a home that has never known sorrow. We will use it to drive the sorrow out of your life." The woman set off at once in search of that magical mustard seed. She came first to a splendid mansion, knocked at the door, and said, "I am looking for a home that has never known sorrow. Is this such a place? It is very important to me." They told her, "You've certainly come to the wrong place," and began to describe all the tragic things that had recently befallen them. The woman said to herself, "Who is better able to help these poor unfortunate people than I, who have had misfortune of my own?" She stayed to comfort them, then went on in her search for a home that had never known sorrow. But wherever she turned, in hovels and in palaces, she found one tale after another of sadness and misfortune. Ultimately, she became so involved in ministering to other people's grief that she forgot about her quest for the magical mustard seed, never realizing that it had in fact driven the sorrow out of her life. Perhaps that is the only cure for jealousy, to realize that the people we resent and envy for having what we lack, probably have wounds and scars of their own. They may even be envying us. The married woman who tries to comfort her widowed neighbor may have reason to fear that her husband will lose his job. She may have a delinquent child to worry about. The pregnant sister-in-law may have gotten some disturbing news about her own health. When I was a young rabbi, people would often resist my efforts to help them in their sorrow. Who was I, young, healthy, gainfully employed, to come in and mouth cliches about sharing their pain? Over the years, though, as they learned more about our son's illness and prognosis, the resistance melted. They accepted my consolations now, because they no longer had reason to resent my good fortune as contrasted with their bad luck. I was no longer God's more favored child. I was their brother in suffering, and they were able to let me help them. But everyone is our brother or sister in suffering. No one comes to us from a home which has never known sorrow. They come to help us because they too know what it feels like to be hurt by life. I don't think we should confront one another with our troubles. You think you've got problems? Let me tell you my problems, and you'll realize how well off you are. That sort of competitiveness accomplishes nothing. It is as bad as the competitiveness that spawns sibling rivalry and jealousy. In the first place, The afflicted person is not looking for an invitation to join the suffering Olympics. But it would help if we remembered this: anguish and heartbreak may not be distributed evenly throughout the world, but they are distributed very widely. Everyone. 7. God can't do everything, but He can do some important things. It is shortly before 11 o'clock one night when the telephone rings at my home. I find that telephones have a special, ominous way of ringing late at night, telling you even before you answer them that something bad is happening. I answer, and the voice at the other end identifies himself as someone I have never met, nor is he a member of my congregation. He tells me that his mother is in the hospital, and will undergo a serious operation the following morning. Would I please say a prayer for her recovery? I try to get more information, but the man is clearly upset and in a state of turmoil. I settle for writing down his mother's Hebrew name, assure him that the prayer will be offered, and wish him and his mother well. I hang up. And I feel troubled, as I often do after such a conversation. Praying for a person's health, for a favorable outcome of an operation, has implications that ought to disturb a thoughtful person. If prayer worked the way many people think it does, no one would ever die, because no prayer is ever offered more sincerely than the prayer for life, for health, and recovery. From illness, for ourselves and for those we love. If we believe in God, but we do not hold God responsible for life's tragedies, if we believe that God wants justice and fairness but cannot always arrange for them, what are we doing when we pray to God for a favorable outcome to a crisis in our life? Do I and does the man who called me really believe in a God who has the power to cure malignancies and influence the outcome of surgery, and will do that only if the right person recites the right words in the right language? And will God let a person die because a stranger, praying on her behalf, got some of the words wrong? Who among us could respect or worship a God whose implicit message was, I could have made your mother healthy again, but you didn't plead and grovel enough? And if we don't get what we prayed for, how do we keep from either being angry with God or feeling that we have been judged and found wanting? How do we avoid feeling that God has let us down just when we needed Him most? And how do we avoid the equally undesirable alternative of feeling that God has disapproved of us? Imagine the mind and heart of a blind or crippled child who has been raised on pious stories with happy endings, stories of people who prayed and were miraculously cured. Imagine that child praying with all the sincerity and innocence he can muster, that God make him whole, like other children. And now imagine his grief, his anger turned outward at God and at those who told him those stories, or turned inward on himself, when he realizes that his handicap is going to be permanent. What better way to teach children to hate God than to teach them that God could have cured them, but, for their own good, chose not to? There are several ways in which we can answer the person who asks, "Why didn't I get what I prayed for?" And most of the answers are problematic, leading to feelings of guilt, or anger, or hopelessness. You didn't get what you prayed for, because you didn't deserve it. You didn't get what you prayed for, because you didn't pray hard enough. You didn't get what you prayed for, because God knows what is best for you better than you do. You didn't get what you prayed for, because someone else's prayer for the opposite result was more worthy. You didn't get what you prayed for, because prayer is a sham. God doesn't hear prayers. You didn't get what you prayed for because there is no God. If we are not satisfied with any of these answers, but don't want to give up on the idea of prayer, there is one other possibility. We can change our understanding of what it means to pray, and what it means for our prayers to be answered. The Talmud, the compilation of discussions of Jewish law which I have quoted earlier in this book, gives examples of bad prayers, improper prayers, which one should not utter. If a woman is pregnant, neither she nor her husband should pray, "May God grant that this child be a boy," nor, for that matter, may they pray that it be a girl. The sex of the child is determined at conception, and God cannot be invoked to change it. Again, if a man sees a fire engine racing toward his neighborhood, he should not pray, "Please God, don't let the fire be in my house." Not only is it mean-spirited to pray that someone else's house burn instead of yours, but it is futile. A certain house is already on fire, the most sincere or articulate of prayers will not affect the question of which house it is. We can extend this logic to contemporary situations. It would be equally improper for a high school senior, holding a letter from a college admissions office, to pray, "Please God, let it be an acceptance," or for a person waiting for the report of a biopsy to pray, "Please God, let everything be all right." As with the Talmudic cases of the pregnant woman and the burning house, certain conditions already exist. We cannot ask God to go back and rewrite the past. Neither, as we have suggested already, can we ask God to change laws of nature for our benefit, to make fatal conditions less fatal, or to change the inexorable course of an illness. Sometimes miracles do happen. Malignancies mysteriously disappear, incurable patients recover, and baffled doctors credit it to an act of God. All we can do in a case like that is echo the doctor's bewildered gratitude. We don't know why some people spontaneously recover from illnesses which kill or cripple others. We don't know why some people die in car crashes or plane crashes, while other people, sitting right next to them, walk away with a few cuts and bruises and a bad scare. I can't believe that God chooses to hear the prayers of some and not of others. There would be no discernible rhyme or reason to His doing that. No amount of research into the lives of those who died and those who survived would help us learn how to live or how to pray so that we too would win God's favor. When miracles occur, and people beat the odds against their survival, we would be well advised to bow our heads in thanks at the presence of a miracle, and not think that our prayers, contributions, or abstentions are what did it. The next time we try, we may wonder why our prayers are ineffective. Another category of prayer not fit for praying would be prayers meant to do someone else harm. If prayer, like religion as a whole, is meant to enlarge our souls, it should not be put to the service of meanness, envy, or vengeance. The story is told of two shopkeepers who were bitter rivals. Their stores were across the street from each other, and they would spend each day sitting in the doorway, keeping track of each other's business. If one got a customer, he would smile in triumph at his rival. One night, an angel appeared to one of the shopkeepers in a dream and said, "God has sent me to teach you a lesson. He will give you anything you ask for, but I want you to know that, whatever you get, your competitor across the street will get twice as much. Would you be wealthy? You can be very wealthy. But he will be twice as rich. Do you want to live a long and healthy life? You can, but his life will be longer and healthier. You can be famous, have children you will be proud of, whatever you desire. But whatever you get, he will get twice as much." The man frowned, thought for a moment, and said, "All right, my request is, strike me blind in one eye." Finally, we cannot ask God in prayer to do something which is within our power, so as to spare us the chore of doing it. A contemporary theologian has written these words: "We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to end war. For we know that you have made the world in a way that man must find his own path to peace within himself and with his neighbor. We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to end starvation. For you have already given us the resources with which to feed the entire world, if we would only use them wisely. We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to root out prejudice. For you have already given us eyes with which to see the good in all men, if we would only use them rightly. We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to end despair. For you have already given us the power to clear away slums and to give hope, if we would only use our power justly. We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to end disease. For you have already given us great minds with which to search out cures and healing, if we would only use them constructively. Therefore we pray to you instead, O God, for strength, determination, and willpower, to do instead of just to pray, to become instead of merely to wish." Jack Reamer, Lakrat Shabbat. If we cannot pray for the impossible, or the unnatural, if we cannot pray out of a sense of revenge or irresponsibility, asking God to do our work for us, what is left for us to pray for? What can prayer do for us, to help us when we hurt? The first thing prayer does for us is to put us in touch with other people, People who share the same concerns, values, dreams, and pains that we do. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, one of the founders of the discipline of sociology was a French man by the name of Émile Durkheim. The grandson of an Orthodox rabbi, Durkheim was interested in the role that society played in shaping a person's religious and ethical outlook. He spent years in the South Sea Islands studying the religion of primitive natives in order to find out what religion was like before it was formalized with prayer books and professional clergy. In 1912, he published his important book Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, in which he suggested that the primary purpose of religion at its earliest level was not to put people in touch with God, but to put them in touch with one another. Religious rituals taught people how to share with their neighbors the experiences of birth and bereavement, of children marrying and parents dying. There were rituals for planting and for harvesting, for the winter solstice and for the vernal equinox. In that way, the community would be able to share the most joyous and the most frightening moments of life. No one would have to face them alone. I think that is still what religion does best. Even people who are not ordinarily ritually inclined respond to a traditional wedding in the presence of friends and neighbors, with familiar words spoken and familiar ceremonies performed, even though their marriage would be just as legal if it were performed in the privacy of a judge's chambers. We need to share our joys with other people, and we need even more to share our fears and our grief. The Jewish custom of sitting Shiva, the memorial week after a death, like the Christian wake or chapel visit, grows out of this need. When we feel so terribly alone, singled out by the hand of fate, when we are tempted to crawl off in a dark corner and feel sorry for ourselves, we need to be reminded that we are part of a community, that there are people around who care about us and that we are still part of the stream of life. At this point, religion structures what we do, forcing us to be with people and to let them into our lives. So often, when I meet with a family after a death and before a funeral service, they will ask me, do we really need to sit Shiva, to have all those people crowding into our living room? Couldn't we just ask them to leave us alone? My response is, no, letting people into your home, into your grief, is exactly what you need now. You need to share with them, to talk to them, to let them comfort you. You need to be reminded that you are still alive, and part of a world of life. There is a marvelous custom in the Jewish mourning ritual called Seudat Havra'ah, the meal of replenishment. On returning from the cemetery, the mourner is not supposed to take food for himself, or to serve others. Other people have to feed him, symbolizing the way the community rallies around him to sustain him and to try to fill the emptiness in his world. And when the mourner attends services to recite the mourner's Kaddish, the prayer recited for a year after a death, he feels the context of a supportive, sympathetic congregation around him. He sees and hears other mourners, bereaved even as he is, and he feels less singled out by adverse fate. He is comforted by their presence, by his being accepted and consoled by the community rather than being shunned as a victim whom God has seen fit to punish. In the incident with which this chapter began, a stranger phoned me to ask me to pray for his mother, who was going to be operated on. Why did I agree, if I don't believe that my prayers, or his, for that matter, will move God to affect the results of the surgery? By agreeing, I was saying to him, I hear your concern about your mother. I understand that you are worried and afraid of what might happen. I want you to know that I and your neighbors in this community share that concern. We are with you, even though we don't know you, because we can imagine ourselves being in your situation and wanting and needing all the support we can get. We are hoping and praying along with you that things turn out well, so that you don't have to feel that you are facing this frightening situation alone. If it helps you, if it helps your mother, to know that we too are concerned and hoping for her recovery, let me assure you that that is the case. And I firmly believe that knowing that people care can affect the course of a person's health. Prayer, when it is offered in the right way, redeems people from isolation. It assures them that they need not feel alone and abandoned. It lets them know that they are part of a greater reality, with more depth, more hope, more courage, and more of a future than any individual could have by himself. One goes to a religious service, one recites the traditional prayers. Not in order to find God, there are plenty of other places where he can be found, but to find a congregation, to find people with whom you can share that which means the most to you. From that point of view, just being able to pray helps, whether your prayer changes the world outside you or not. That wonderful storyteller Harry Golden makes this point in one of his stories. When he was young, he once asked his father, "If you don't believe in God, why do you go to synagogue so regularly?" His father answered, "Jews go to synagogue for all sorts of reasons. My friend Garfinkel, who is Orthodox, goes to talk to God. I go to talk to Garfinkel." But that is only half of the answer to our question, what good does it do to pray? Perhaps the less important half. Beyond putting us in touch with other people, prayer puts us in touch with God. I am not sure prayer puts us in touch with God the way many people think it does, that we approach God as a supplicant, a beggar asking for favors, or as a customer presenting him with a shopping list and asking what it will cost. Prayer is not primarily a matter of asking God to change things. If we can come to understand what prayer can and should be, and rid ourselves of some unrealistic expectations, we will be better able to call on prayer, and on God, when we need them most. Let me contrast two prayers found in the Bible, both spoken by the same person, in almost the same circumstances, 20 years apart. Both are found in the book of Genesis, in the cycle of stories about the lives of the patriarchs. In chapter 28, Jacob is a young man, spending his first night away from home. He has left his parents' home, having quarreled with his father and brother, and is traveling on foot to the land of Aram to live with his uncle Laban. Scared and inexperienced, feeling ashamed of what he has done at home and not knowing what lies in store for him at Laban's house, he prays, "If God will be with me on this venture, protecting me, giving me food to eat and clothes to wear, and if I come back safe to my father's house, then the Lord will be my only God. I will dedicate an altar to him, and set aside a tenth of all I earn for him." Jacob's prayer here is the prayer of a frightened young man who is setting out to do something hard, is not sure he can do it, and thinks he can bribe God to make things work out for him. He is prepared to make it worth God's while to protect him and make him prosper, and he apparently believes in a God whose favor can be won and whose protection can be bought with promises of prayer, charity, and exclusive worship. His attitude, much like that of so many people today, facing illness or misfortune, is expressed in this way: "Please God, make this work out well and I'll do whatever you want. I'll stop lying, I'll go to services regularly, you name it, and I'll do it if you just grant me this." When we are not personally involved, we can recognize the immaturity of this attitude, and the immature picture of God at work here. It is not immoral to think that way, but it is inaccurate. That is not the way the world works. God's blessings are not for sale. Ultimately, Jacob learns that lesson. As the biblical account of his life continues, Jacob spends 20 years at Laban's house. He marries Laban's 2 daughters and has many children. He works hard and accumulates the beginnings of a small fortune. Then the day comes for him to take his wives and children, his flocks and herds, and go home. He comes to the same river bank where he had stood and prayed in chapter 28. Again, he is anxious and afraid. Again, he is heading into a new country, an unfamiliar situation. He knows that the next day he will have to confront his brother Esau, who had threatened to kill him 20 years earlier. Once again, Jacob prays. But this time, because he is 20 years older and wiser, he offers a very different prayer than he did as a boy. In chapter 32 of Genesis, Jacob prays, "God of my father Abraham and of my father Isaac, I am unworthy of all the kindness you have shown me. I last crossed this river with nothing but my staff in my hand, and now I have grown to 2 camps. Deliver me, I pray, from my brother Esau, for I am afraid of him. For it was you who said to me, I will make your offspring like the sand of the sea." In other words, Jacob's prayer no longer tries to make a deal with God. Nor does it present God with a long list of demands: food, clothing, prosperity, a safe return. It acknowledges that there is no currency in which God can be paid for blessing and helping us. Jacob's mature prayer says simply, God, I have no claims on you and nothing to offer you. You have already given me more than I had any right to expect. There is only one reason for my turning to you now: because I need you. I am scared. I have to face up to something hard tomorrow, and I am not sure I can do it alone without you. God, you once gave me reason to believe that I was capable of making something of my life. If you meant it, then you had better help me now, because I can't handle this alone. Jacob doesn't ask God to make Esau go away, to cripple Esau's strength, or magically erase his memory. Jacob asks God only to make him less afraid, by letting him know that he is at his side, so that whatever the next day might bring, he will be able to handle it because he won't have to face it alone. That is the kind of prayer that God answers. We can't pray that He make our lives free of problems. This won't happen, and it is probably just as well. We can't ask Him to make us and those we love immune to disease, because He can't do that. We can't ask Him to weave a magic spell around us so that bad things will only happen to other people, and never to us. People who pray for miracles usually don't get miracles, any more than children who pray for bicycles, good grades, or boyfriends get them as a result of praying. But people who pray for courage, for strength to bear the unbearable, for the grace to remember what they have left instead of what they have lost, very often find their prayers answered. They discover that they have more strength, more courage than they ever knew themselves to have. Where did they get it? I would like to think that their prayers helped them find that strength. Their prayers helped them tap hidden reserves of faith and courage which were not available to them before. The widow who asks me on the day of her husband's funeral, "What do I have to live for now?" yet in the course of the ensuing weeks finds reasons to wake up in the morning and look forward to the day. The man who has lost his job or closed his business and says to me, "Rabbi, I'm too old and tired to start all over again," but starts over again nonetheless. Where did they get the strength, the hope, the optimism that they did not have on the day they asked me those questions? I would like to believe that they received those things from the context of a concerned community, people who made it clear to them that they cared, and from the knowledge that God is at the side of the afflicted and the downcast. If we think of life as a kind of Olympic Games, some of life's crises are sprints. They require maximum emotional concentration for a short time. Then they are over, and life returns to normal. But other crises are distance events. They ask us to maintain our concentration over a much longer period of time, and that can be a lot harder. I have visited people in the hospital after they have been badly burned or had their backs broken in accidents. For the first few days, they are grateful to be alive and full of confidence. "I'm a fighter, I'll beat this." In those first days, friends and family cluster around them, supportive and solicitous about their well-being, full of sympathy and concern. Then, as days grow into weeks and months, the pace of the extended crisis takes its toll on patient and relative alike. The sick person grows impatient with the sameness of the daily routine and the lack of discernible progress. He becomes angry at himself for not healing faster, or at the doctors for not having the magic to produce instant results. The wife who was so solicitous when her husband's lung cancer was diagnosed, finds herself becoming testy and impatient. "Sure, I feel sorry for him, but I'm a person with needs too. For years he overworked himself, neglected his health, and now that it has caught up with him, he expects me to give up my own life and become his nursemaid." Of course she loves her husband, and of course she feels terrible that he is so sick. But she may be getting tired of an ordeal with no end in sight. She may be afraid of being left a widow, concerned about her financial future, angry at him for getting sick, especially if he had in fact been smoking or neglecting his health, worn out from sleepless nights of worry. She is experiencing fear and fatigue, but it comes out as impatience and anger. Similarly, the parents of a retarded child face a long-term situation with No prospect of a happy ending. The early years of sympathy, resignation, taking delight in every faltering step and garbled word, may give way to a time of frustration and anger as the child falls further behind his age mates, and forgets even those things they have so painstakingly taught him. Then, in all likelihood, the parents will feel guilty and blame themselves for losing patience with a child whose limitations are no fault of his own. Where do such parents get the strength they will need to go on day after day? For that matter, how does the man suffering from inoperable cancer, or the woman with Parkinson's disease, find the strength and sense of purpose to get up and face each new day, when there is no prospect of a happy ending? I believe that God is the answer for these people as well, but not in the same way. I don't believe that God causes mental retardation in children, or chooses who should suffer from muscular dystrophy. The God I believe in does not send us the problem, He gives us the strength to cope with the problem. Where do you get the strength to go on, when you have used up all of your own strength? Where do you turn for patience when you have run out of patience, when you have been more patient for more years than anyone should be asked to be, and the end is nowhere in sight? I believe that God gives us strength and patience and hope, renewing our spiritual resources when they run dry. How else do sick people manage to find more strength and more good humor over the course of prolonged illness than any one person could possibly have, unless God was constantly replenishing their souls? How else do widows find the courage to pick up the pieces of their lives and go out to face the world alone, when on the day of their husband's funeral, they did not have that courage? How else do the parents of a retarded or brain-damaged youngster wake up every morning and turn again to their responsibilities, unless they are able to lean on God when they grow weak? We don't have to beg or bribe God to give us strength or hope or patience. We need only turn to Him, admit that we can't do this on our own, and understand that bravely bearing up under long-term illness is one of the most human, and one of the most godly, things we can ever do. One of the things that constantly reassures me that God is real, and not just an idea that religious leaders made up, is the fact that people who pray for strength, hope, and courage so often find resources of strength, hope, and courage that they did not have before they prayed. I also believe that sick children should pray. They should pray for the strength to bear what they have to bear. They should pray that sickness and its treatment not hurt them too much. They should pray as a way of talking out their fears without the embarrassment of having to say them out loud, and as a reassurance that they are not alone. God is close to them even late at night in the hospital when their parents have gone home and all the doctors have left. God is still with them even when they are so sick that their friends no longer come to visit. The fear of pain and the fear of abandonment are perhaps the most troubling aspects of a child's illness, and prayer should be used to ease those fears. Sick children can even pray for a miracle to restore them to good health, as long as they do not feel that God is judging them to decide whether or not they deserve a miracle. They should pray because the alternative would be giving up all hope and marking time until the end comes. If God can't make my sickness go away, what good is He? Who needs Him? God does not want you to be sick or crippled. He didn't make you have this problem, and He doesn't want you to go on having it, but He can't make it go away. That is something which is too hard even for God. What good is He, then? God makes people become doctors and nurses to try to make you feel better. God helps us be brave even when we're sick and frightened, and He reassures us that we don't have to face our fears and our pains alone. The conventional explanation, that God sends us the burden because He knows that we are strong enough to handle it, has it all wrong. Fate, not God, sends us the problem. When we try to deal with it, we find out that we are not strong. We are weak, we get tired, we get angry, overwhelmed. We begin to wonder how we will ever make it through all the years. But when we reach the limits of our own strength and courage, something unexpected happens. We find reinforcement coming from a source outside of ourselves. And in the knowledge that we are not alone, that God is on our side, we manage to go on. It was in this way that I answered the young widow who challenged me about the efficacy of prayer. Her husband had died of cancer, and she told me that while he was terminally ill, she prayed for his recovery. Her parents, her in-laws, and her neighbors all prayed. A Protestant neighbor invoked the prayer circle of her church, and a Catholic neighbor sought the intercession of St. Jude, patron saint of hopeless causes. Every variety, language, and idiom of prayer was mustered on his behalf, and none of them worked. He died right on schedule, leaving her and her young children bereft of a husband and father. After all that, she said to me, "How can anyone be expected to take prayer seriously? Is it really true," I asked her, "that your prayers were not answered? Your husband died, there was no miraculous cure for his illness. But what did happen? Your friends and relatives prayed, Jews, Catholics, and Protestants prayed. At a time when you felt so desperately alone, you found out that you were not alone at all. You found out how many other people were hurting for you and with you, and that is no small thing. They were trying to tell you that this was not happening to you because you were a bad person. It was just a rotten, unfair thing that no one could help. They were trying to tell you that your husband's life meant a lot to them too, and not only to you and your children, and that whatever happened to him, you would not be totally alone. That is what their prayers were saying, and I suspect that it made a difference." "And what about your prayers?" I asked her. "Were they left unanswered? You faced a situation that could easily have broken your spirit, a situation that could have left you a bitter, withdrawn woman, jealous of the intact families around you, incapable of responding to the promise of being alive. Somehow that did not happen. Somehow you found the strength not to let yourself be broken. You found the resiliency to go on living and caring about things. Like Jacob in the Bible, like every one of us at one time or another, you faced a scary situation, prayed for help, and found out that you were a lot stronger, and a lot better able to handle it, than you ever would have thought you were. In your desperation, you opened your heart in prayer, and what happened? You didn't get a miracle to avert a tragedy. But you discovered people around you, and God beside you, and strength within you to help you survive the tragedy. What good, then, is religion? In a sense, I have been writing this book for 15 years. From the day I heard the word progeria and was told what it meant, I knew that I would one day have to face Aaron's declining and dying. And I knew that, after he died, I would feel the need to write a book, sharing with others the story of how we managed to go on believing in God and in the world after we had been hurt. I didn't know what I would call the book, and I wasn't totally sure what I would say. But I knew that the page after the title page would carry a dedication to Aaron. I could visualize the dedication to him, and under it, in my mind's eye, I could see the quotation from the Bible, the words of King David after the death of his son, Absalom, "My son, would that I had died instead of you." Then one day, a year and a half after Aaron's death, I realized that I was visualizing that page differently in my imagination. Now instead of the passage in which David wishes he were dead and his son alive, I saw in my mind's eye the words of David after the death of an earlier child, the passage that I have in fact used in part on the dedication page of this book. When David saw the servants whispering, he said to them, "Is the child dead?" And they said, "He is dead." And David rose and washed and changed his clothing and asked that food be set before him, and he ate. The servants said to him, "What is this that you are doing? You fasted and wept for the child when he was alive, and now that he is dead, you get up and eat." And David said, "While the child was yet alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, 'Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me and the child will live?' But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me." 2 Samuel 12:19-23. I knew then that the time had come for me to write my book. I had gone beyond self-pity to the point of facing and accepting my son's death. A book telling people how much I hurt would not do anyone any good. This had to be a book that would affirm life. It would have to say that no one ever promised us a life free from pain and disappointment. The most anyone promised us was that we would not be alone in our pain, and that we would be able to draw upon a source outside ourselves for the strength and courage we would need to survive life's tragedies and life's unfairness. I am a more sensitive person, a more effective pastor, a more sympathetic counselor because of Aaron's life and death than I would ever have been without it. And I would give up all of those gains in a second if I could have my son back. If I could choose, I would forego all the spiritual growth and depth which has come my way because of our experiences, and be what I was 15 years ago, an average rabbi, an indifferent counselor, helping some people and unable to help others, and the father of a bright, happy boy. But I cannot choose. I believe in God. But I do not believe the same things about Him that I did years ago, when I was growing up or when I was a theological student. I recognize His limitations. He is limited in what He can do by laws of nature, and by the evolution of human nature and human moral freedom. I no longer hold God responsible for illnesses, accidents, and natural disasters, because I realize that I gain little and I lose so much when I blame God for those things. I can worship a God who hates suffering but cannot eliminate it more easily than I can worship a God who chooses to make children suffer and die, for whatever exalted reason. Some years ago, when the death of God theology was a fad, I remember seeing a bumper sticker that read, "My God is not dead, sorry about yours." I guess my bumper sticker would read, "My God is not cruel, sorry about yours." God does not cause our misfortunes. Some are caused by bad luck, some are caused by bad people, and some are simply an inevitable consequence of our being human and being mortal, living in a world of inflexible natural laws. The painful things that happen to us are not punishments for our misbehavior, nor are they in any way part of some grand design on God's part. Because the tragedy is not God's will, we need not feel hurt or betrayed by God when tragedy strikes. We can turn to Him for help in overcoming it, precisely because we can tell ourselves that God is as outraged by it as we are. Does that mean that my suffering has no meaning? That is the most significant challenge that can be offered to the point of view I have been advocating in this book. We could bear nearly any pain or disappointment if we thought there was a reason behind it, a purpose to it. But even a lesser burden becomes too much for us if we feel it makes no sense. Patients in a veterans hospital who have been seriously wounded in combat have an easier time adjusting to their injuries than do patients with exactly the same injury sustained while fooling around on a basketball court or in a swimming pool, because they can tell themselves that their suffering at least was in a good cause. Parents who can convince themselves that there is some purpose somewhere served by their child's handicap can accept it better for the same reason. Do you remember the biblical story, in chapter 32 of Exodus, about Moses, how, when he came down from Mount Sinai and saw the Israelites worshipping the golden calf, he threw down the tablets of the 10 Commandments so that they shattered? There is a Jewish legend that tells us that while Moses was climbing down the mountain with the 2 stone tablets on which God had written the 10 Commandments, he had no trouble carrying them, although they were large, heavy slabs of stone and the path was steep. After all, though they were heavy, they had been inscribed by God and were precious to Him. But when Moses came upon the people dancing around the golden calf, the legend goes, the words disappeared from the stone. They were just blank stones again. And now they became too heavy for him to hold on to. We could bear any burden if we thought there was a meaning to what we were doing. Have I made it harder for people to accept their illnesses, their misfortunes, their family tragedies by telling them that they are not sent by God as part of some master plan of His? Let me suggest that the bad things that happen to us in our lives do not have a meaning when they happen to us. They do not happen for any good reason which would cause us to accept them willingly. But we can give them a meaning. We can redeem these tragedies from senselessness by imposing meaning on them. The question we should be asking is not, why did this happen to me? What did I do to deserve this? That is really an unanswerable, pointless question. A better question would be, now that this has happened to me, what am I going to do about it? Martin Gray, a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto and the Holocaust, writes of his life in a book called For Those I Loved. He tells how, after the Holocaust, he rebuilt his life, became successful, married, and raised a family. Life seemed good after the horrors of the concentration camp. Then, one day, his wife and children were killed when a forest fire ravaged their home in the south of France. Gray was distraught, pushed almost to the breaking point by this added tragedy. People urged him to demand an inquiry into what caused the fire, but instead he chose to put his resources into a movement to protect nature from future fires. He explained that an inquiry, an investigation, would focus only on the past, on issues of pain and sorrow and blame. He wanted to focus on the future. An inquiry would set him against other people. Was someone negligent? Whose fault was it? And being against other people, setting out to find a villain, accusing other people of being responsible for your misery, only makes a lonely person lonelier. Life, he concluded, has to be lived for something, not just against something. We too need to get over the questions that focus on the past and on the pain, why did this happen to me? And ask instead the question which opens doors to the future, now that this has happened, what shall I do about it? Let me once again cite Dorothy Soel, the German theologian whom we quoted in chapter 5, asking whose side we thought God was on in the concentration camps, the murderer's side or the victim's side. Soel, in her book Suffering, suggests that the most important question we can ask about suffering is whom it serves. Does our suffering serve God or the devil, the cause of becoming alive or being morally paralyzed? Not where does the tragedy come from, but where does it lead, is the issue on which Soel would have us focus. In this context she speaks of the devil's martyrs. What does she mean by that phrase? We are familiar with the idea that various religions honor the memories of martyrs for God. People who died in such a way as to bear witness to their faith. By remembering their faith in the face of death, our own faith is strengthened. Such people are God's martyrs. But the forces of despair and disbelief have their martyrs too, people whose death weakens other people's faith in God and in His world. If the death of an elderly woman in Auschwitz or of a child in a hospital ward leaves us doubting God and less able to affirm the world's goodness, then that woman and that child become the devil's martyrs, witnesses against God, against the meaningfulness of a moral life, rather than witnesses in favor. But, and this is Soel's most important point, it is not the circumstances of their death that makes them witnesses for or against God. It is our reaction to their death. The facts of life and death are neutral. We, by our responses, give suffering either a positive or a negative meaning. Illnesses, accidents, human tragedies kill people. But they do not necessarily kill life or faith. If the death and suffering of someone we love makes us bitter, jealous, against all religion, and incapable of happiness, we turn the person who died into one of the devil's martyrs. If suffering and death in someone close to us bring us to explore the limits of our capacity for strength and love and cheerfulness, if it leads us to discover sources of consolation we never knew before, then we make the person into a witness for the affirmation of life rather than its rejection. This means, Soel suggests, that there is one thing we can still do for those we loved and lost. We could not keep them alive. Perhaps we could not even significantly lessen their pain. But the one crucial thing we can do for them after their death is to let them be witnesses for God and for life, rather than, by our despair and loss of faith, making them the devil's martyrs. The dead depend on us for their redemption and their immortality. Soel's words make it clear how we can act positively in the face of tragedy. But what about God's role? If God does not cause the bad things that happen to good people, and if He cannot prevent them, what good is He at all? First of all, God has created a world in which many more good things than bad things happen. We find life's disasters upsetting not only because they are painful but because they are exceptional. Most people wake up on most days feeling good. Most illnesses are curable. Most airplanes take off and land safely. Most of the time, when we send our children out to play, they come home safely. The accident, the robbery, the inoperable tumor are life-shattering exceptions, but they are very rare exceptions. When you have been hurt by life, it may be hard to keep that in mind. When you are standing very close to a large object, all you can see is the object. Only by stepping back from it can you also see the rest of its setting around it. When we are stunned by some tragedy, we can only see and feel the tragedy. Only with time and distance can we see the tragedy in the context of a whole life and a whole world. In the Jewish tradition, the special prayer known as the Mourner's Kaddish is not about death, but about life, and it praises God for having created a basically good and livable world. By reciting that prayer, the mourner is reminded of all that is good and worth living for. There is a crucial difference between denying the tragedy, insisting that everything is for the best, and seeing the tragedy in the context of a whole life, keeping one's eye and mind on what has enriched you and not only on what you have lost. How does God make a difference in our lives if He neither kills nor cures? God inspires people to help other people who have been hurt by life. And by helping them, they protect them from the danger of feeling alone, abandoned, or judged. God makes some people want to become doctors and nurses, to spend days and nights of self-sacrificing concern with an intensity for which no money can compensate, in the effort to sustain life and alleviate pain. God moves people to want to be medical researchers, to focus their intelligence and energy on the causes and possible cures for some of life's tragedies. When I was a boy, early summer was the most pleasant weather of the year in New York City, but it was a time of dread for young families because of the fear of a polio epidemic. But human beings used their God-given intelligence to eliminate that fear. Throughout human history, there have been plagues and epidemics that wiped out whole cities. People felt that they had to have 6 or 8 children so that some at least would survive to adulthood. Human intelligence has come to understand more about the natural laws concerning sanitation, germs, immunization, antibiotics, and has succeeded in eliminating many of those scourges. God, who neither causes nor prevents tragedies, helps by inspiring people to help. As a 19th century Hasidic rabbi once put it, human beings are God's language. God shows His opposition to cancer and birth defects not by eliminating them or making them happen only to bad people. He can't do that, but by summoning forth friends and neighbors to ease the burden and to fill the emptiness. We were sustained in Aaron's illness by people who made a point of showing that they cared and understood, the man who made Aaron a scaled-down tennis racket suitable to his size, and the woman who gave him a small handmade violin that was a family heirloom, the friend who got him a baseball autographed by the Red Sox, and the children who overlooked his appearance and physical limitations to play stickball with him in the backyard, and who wouldn't let him get away with anything special. People like that were God's language, His way of telling our family that we were not alone, not cast off. In the same way, I firmly believe that Aaron served God's purposes, not by being sick or strange looking. There was no reason why God should have wanted that, but by facing up so bravely to his illness and to the problems caused by his appearance. I know that his friends and schoolmates were affected by his courage and by the way he managed to live a full life despite his limitations. And I know that people who knew our family were moved to handle the difficult times of their own lives with more hope and courage when they saw our example. I take these as instances of God moving people here on earth to help other people in need. And finally, to the person who asks, what good is God? Who needs religion, if these things happen to good people and bad people alike? I would say that God may not prevent the calamity, but He gives us the strength and the perseverance to overcome it. Where else do we get these qualities which we did not have before? The heart attack which slows down a 46-year-old businessman does not come from God, but the determination to change his lifestyle, to stop smoking, to care less about expanding his business and care more about spending time with his family. Because his eyes have been opened to what is truly important to him, those things come from God. God does not stand for heart attacks, those are nature's responses to the body's being overstressed. But God does stand for self-discipline and for being part of a family. The flood that devastates a town is not an act of God, even if the insurance companies find it useful to call it that. But the efforts people make to save lives, risking their own lives for a person who might be a total stranger to them, and the determination to rebuild their community after the flood waters have receded, do qualify as acts of God. When a person is dying of cancer, I do not hold God responsible for the cancer or for the pain he feels. They have other causes. But I have seen God give such people the strength to take each day as it comes, to be grateful for a day full of sunshine or one in which they are relatively free of pain. When people who were never particularly strong become strong in the face of adversity, when people who tended to think only of themselves become unselfish and heroic in an emergency, I have to ask myself where they got these qualities which they would freely admit they did not have before. My answer is that this is one of the ways in which God helps us. When we suffer beyond the limits of our own strength. Life is not fair. The wrong people get sick and the wrong people get robbed and the wrong people get killed in wars and in accidents. Some people see life's unfairness and decide, there is no God, the world is nothing but chaos. Others see the same unfairness and ask themselves, where do I get my sense of what is fair and what is unfair? Where do I get my sense of outrage and indignation, my instinctive response of sympathy? When I read in the paper about a total stranger who has been hurt by life. Don't I get these things from God? Doesn't He plant in me a little bit of His own divine outrage at injustice and oppression, just as He did for the prophets of the Bible? Isn't my feeling of compassion for the afflicted just a reflection of the compassion He feels when He sees the suffering of His creatures? Are responding to life's unfairness with sympathy and with righteous indignation, God's compassion, and God's anger working through us, may be the surest proof of all of God's reality. Religion alone can affirm the afflicted person's sense of self-worth. Science can describe what has happened to a person, only religion can call it a tragedy. Only the voice of religion, when it frees itself from the need to defend and justify God for all that happens, can say to the afflicted person, you are a good person, and you deserve better. Let me come and sit with you so that you will know that you are not alone. None of us can avoid the problem of why bad things happen to good people. Sooner or later, each of us finds himself playing one of the roles in the story of Job, whether as victim of tragedy, as a member of the family, or as a friend comforter. The questions never change, the search for a satisfying answer continues. In our generation, the gifted poet Archibald MacLeish has given us his version of the Job story in a modern setting. The first half of his poetic drama J.B. retells the familiar story. J.B., the Job figure, is a successful businessman surrounded by an attractive, loving family. Then one by one, his children die. His business fails, his health fails. Finally, his whole city and much of the world are destroyed in a nuclear war. 3 friends come to comfort J.B., just as in the biblical story, and once again their words are more self-serving than comforting. In MacLeish's version, the first comforter is a Marxist who assures J.B. that none of his suffering is his fault. He just had the bad luck to be a member of the wrong economic class at the wrong time. He was a capitalist at the time of capitalism's decline. Had he lived the same life in another century, he would not have been punished. He is not suffering for any of his own sins. He just got in the way of the steamroller of historical necessity. J.B. is not comforted by this view. It takes his own personal tragedy too lightly, by seeing him only as a member of a certain class. The second comforter is a psychiatrist. J.B. is not guilty, he tells him, because there is no such thing as guilt. Now that we understand what makes human beings tick, we know that we do not choose. We only think we choose. Really, we simply respond to instinct. We do not act, we are acted upon. Therefore we have no responsibility, and no guilt. J.B. answers that such a solution, describing him as the passive victim of blind instincts, robs him of his humanity. I'd rather suffer every unspeakable suffering God sends, knowing that it was I that acted, I that chose, than wash my hands with yours in that defiling innocence. The third and last comforter is a clergyman. When J.B. asks him for what sin he is being punished so harshly, he replies, your sin is simple. You were born a man. What is your fault? Man's heart is evil. What you have done. Man's will is evil. JB is a sinner worthy of punishment not because of anything specific he has done, but because he is a human being, and human beings are inevitably imperfect and sinful. JB answers him, yours is the cruelest comfort of them all, making the creator of the universe the miscreator of mankind, a party to the crimes he punishes. JB cannot turn for help and comfort to a God who is described as making man imperfect, and then punishing him for his imperfection. Having rejected the explanations of the three comforters, JB turns to God himself, and as in the Bible, God answers, overwhelming JB with his awesomeness, quoting lines directly from the biblical speech out of the whirlwind. Up to this point, McLeish has given us the biblical story of Job in a modern setting. His ending, however, is radically different. In the Bible, the story ends with God rewarding Job for having put up with so much suffering, and gives him new health, new wealth, and new children. In the play, there are no heavenly rewards in the closing scene. Instead, JB goes back to his wife, and they prepare to go on living together and building a new family. Their love, not God's generosity, will provide the new children to replace the ones who died. JB forgives God and commits himself to going on living. His wife says to him, you wanted justice, didn't you? There isn't any. There is only love. The two narrators, representing the perspectives of God and Satan, are baffled. How could a person who has suffered so much in life want more life? Who plays the hero, God, or him? Is God to be forgiven? Isn't he? Job was innocent, you may remember. McLeish's Job answers the problem of human suffering, not with theology or psychology, but by choosing to go on living and creating new life. He forgives God for not making a more just universe, and decides to take it as it is. He stops looking for justice, for fairness in the world, and looks for love instead. In the play's moving last lines, Job's wife says, the candles in churches are out. The stars have gone out in the sky. Blow on the coal of the heart, and we'll see by and by. The world is a cold, unfair place in which everything they held precious has been destroyed. But instead of giving up on this unfair world in life, instead of looking outward, to churches or to nature, for answers, they look inward to their own capacities for loving. Blow on the coal of the heart. For what little light and warmth we will be able to muster to sustain us. In Dimensions of Job, edited by Nahum Glatzer, McLeish has written an essay explaining what he was trying to say in the ending of his Job play. Man depends on God for all things, God depends on man for one. Without man's love, God does not exist as God, only as creator, and love is the one thing no one, not even God himself, can command. It is a free gift, or it is nothing. And it is most itself, most free, when it is offered in spite of suffering, of injustice, and of death. We do not love God because he is perfect. We do not love him because he protects us from all harm and keeps evil things from happening to us. We do not love him because we are afraid of him, or because he will hurt us if we turn our back on him. We love him because he is God, because he is the author of all the beauty and the order around us, the source of our strength and the hope and courage within us, and of other people's strength and hope and courage with which we are helped in our time of need. We love him because he is the best part of ourselves and of our world. That is what it means to love. Love is not the admiration of perfection, but the acceptance of an imperfect person with all his imperfections, because loving and accepting him makes us better and stronger. Is there an answer to the question of why bad things happen to good people? That depends on what we mean by answer. If we mean is there an explanation which will make sense of it all. Why is there cancer in the world? Why did my father get cancer? Why did the plane crash? Why did my child die? Then there is probably no satisfying answer. We can offer learned explanations, but in the end, when we have covered all the squares on the game board and are feeling very proud of our cleverness, the Pain and the anguish and the sense of unfairness will still be there. But the word answer can mean response as well as explanation, and, in that sense, there may well be a satisfying answer to the tragedies in our lives. The response would be Job's response in McLeish's version of the biblical story: to forgive the world for not being perfect, to forgive God for not making a better world, to reach out to the people around us, and to go on living despite it all. In the final analysis, the question of why bad things happen to good people translates itself into some very different questions, no longer asking why something happened, but asking how we will respond, what we intend to do now that it has happened. Are you capable of forgiving and accepting in love a world which has disappointed you by not being perfect, a world in which there is so much unfairness and cruelty, disease and crime, earthquake and accident? Can you forgive its imperfections and love it because it is capable of containing great beauty and goodness, and because it is the only world we have? Are you capable of forgiving and loving the people around you, even if they have hurt you and let you down by not being perfect? Can you forgive them and love them, because there aren't any perfect people around, and because the penalty for not being able to love imperfect people is condemning oneself to loneliness? Are you capable of forgiving and loving God even when you have found out that He is not perfect, even when He has let you down and disappointed you by permitting bad luck and sickness and cruelty in His world, and permitting some of those things to happen to you? Can you learn to love and forgive Him despite His limitations, as Job does, and as you once learned to forgive and love your parents even though they were not as wise, as strong, or as perfect as you needed them to be? And if you can do these things, will you be able to recognize that the ability to forgive and the ability to love are the weapons God has given us to enable us to live fully, bravely, and meaningfully in this less than perfect world? I think of Aaron and all that his life taught me, and I realize how much I have lost and how much I have gained. Yesterday seems less painful.